It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth installment of the Johnson Collection Voices in American Art lecture series. On behalf of my family, the collection staff, and the AC Hotel team, it is particularly gratifying to host this year's event in the AC Hotel, a place that is devoted as much to art as it is to the art of hospitality. Since its formation in 2002, the Johnson Collection's mission has functioned along both the horizontal and vertical axis. In its quest to highlight the significance of Southern art within the canon of American art, the collection's work is both deep and wide, sharing the story of Southern art with audiences far beyond the region. A goal accomplished through loans to national and international museums, scholarly publications, and traveling exhibitions that have toured since 2013 to 22 venues. The collection's work is also decidedly local. If you know anything about my family, and especially about my father, Spartanburg comes first. The well-being and advancement, economic, educational, cultural, and social of this community is a priority. For the Johnson Collection, that means offering rotating exhibitions at the TJC Gallery, located just one block up West Main Street, teaching courses in Southern art at Wofford and Converse colleges, placing works of art like the Battle of Gettysburg, along with many others, on view in public spaces, and hosting this annual event. Tonight, the AC Hotel sits at the intersection of those two important axes. Our guest speaker, Ruth Erickson, is indeed a nationally celebrated voice in American art. In her prestigious position at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, Ruth co-curated the landmark exhibition, Leap Before You Look, a groundbreaking project that has attracted global attention to the unique history and import of Black Mountain College. Ruth's biography appears in tonight's program, but I want to make one additional note. Let it be known that Ruth grew up in Atlanta and spent several summers just up I-26, attending camp in Hendersonville. Ruth, your association with BMC certainly proves the adage that all roads lead home. The art of Black Mountain College and the artist who made it defies common assumptions about Southern art. As the collection hopes to prove every day, Southern art is far more than dreamy landscapes of moonlight and magnolias, or formal portraiture, or historical battle scenes. The collection's founding director, David Henderson, was instrumental in broadening our understanding and reach. We are grateful for his vision in incorporating Black Mountain College. During its 24 years of operation, Black Mountain College drew some of the most avant-garde, cutting-edge creatives to a secluded spot in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a utopian haven where artists working across a spectrum of disciplines thought and worked and lived outside the box, pushing aesthetic boundaries and daring to leap before looking. At the AC Hotel Spartanburg, our goal is to stretch our guests' expectations of what a hotel experience can be, to stretch visitors' perceptions of what Spartanburg is and can be. Like the art of Black Mountain College, the AC is a bit of an outlier, a place that charts a new course and offers an immersive experience, rich in design and culture, and modern. But it's important to know that the experience is not limited to hotel guests. The Black Mountain College masterworks housed here are available to everyone. Whether you're meeting friends in the lobby's AC Lounge, coming for dinner at Level 10 Restaurant, or simply exploring Spartanburg's downtown, all are invited and encouraged to enjoy the inspiration and education this mini museum offers. For that reason, I can think of no better venue for Ruth Erickson to teach us about the experimental and democratic ideals of Black Mountain College. Please welcome Ruth.
How's that? Everybody hear me? Great. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight, everybody, and thank you to the Johnson family and the staff of the Johnson Collection for a lovely almost 36 hours in Spartanburg. You all have a very special town. I told this afternoon I visited here, I think last time when I was 12 years old, and my gosh, this town has changed. It's just like a renaissance. It was so fun walking down Main Street today. So I'm here tonight to share with you a really special story, and that's the story of Black Mountain College. In 2012, I started working on a project that would become the book and exhibition Leap Before You Look, Black Mountain College 1933 to 1957. And it was really the first exhibition of this scale to tell the story of an extraordinary small college and group of people who set out to form a different kind of college that would put the arts at the very center of its curriculum, at the very center of the college. This is the book that we made in conjunction with the exhibition. Here are some views of the exhibition when it opened at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston in 2014. We started the exhibition with a quick timeline of the school. For many audiences in Boston, as well as many audiences in the country, Black Mountain College is a little known history. But part of its kind of smallness of its history and the import and the kind of magnitude of the impact that it had on education and the arts in the 20th century is really first what drew us to the project. These are some views of the exhibition. One of the things that we decided to do in the exhibition is take a series of black and white photographs that we'd found in the archives and blow them up to large scale to try and help transport visitors back to the 1930s, the 1940s, and 50s. The exhibition, we were really lucky it traveled. It went to the Hammer Museum, which is associated with UCLA in Los Angeles. And its final venue was at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, which is associated with The Ohio State University. And it was so important for us that this show ended at two museums that were associated with universities. And I know in the case at the Wexner Center, there were 11 courses that were taught in conjunction with the show, for the show to kind of be able to have the ramifications and the ripple effect on a university campus was really meaningful for us. So that was what the exhibition looked like. But I'm here tonight to tell you the story of the exhibition and share with you some of the most amazing things that we learned in the 4 years of putting it together, and then the subsequent 2 years of touring it around the country. So this is the founder of Black Mountain College. His name is John Rice. He was a classics professor at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. And he was a tenured professor before he was fired by the school's president. And at the time of his firing, which was quite an event at the university, there was a group of faculty and students who left with him. And they left in protest against his firing. And they set out to form a different kind of university, a different kind of college. And that college would be Black Mountain College. Here's one of the very first course books that was created for the college and mailed all over the country to try and attract students. In its very first year, it had 13 students. At its largest, it had 90. So that to kind of give you a sense of it was really small scale all the way through. So John Rice traveled up and down all throughout the South looking for the first home for this kind of renegade college. And they were very lucky to find an absolutely beautiful place in North Carolina, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, near Black Mountain, North Carolina. Here's Joseph Fiore and Nancy Newhall's images of that property. And that's where they formed the very first college. And they actually found a series of YMCA summer camp buildings. And it was there that for very cheap rent, they were able to start their college because the summer camp was only run in the summer. And so during the school year, the building was vacant. And so they formed their college there and ran it for a number of years, every summer having to pack up the entire school, put it up in the attic, and then restart it every September. The college then had a second home, which actually you can see the picture on the right is the beautiful lake that was in their second home called Lake Eden. So there were 2 locations of Black Mountain College during its years of existence. So there were a number of things that set apart Black Mountain College, and these were really John Rice's kind of founding vision for the school. And certainly the most important, and the reason that I'm here tonight talking about it, is that John Rice decided to make the arts at the very center of the curriculum. And the arts in John Rice were both the visual arts, were dancing, was music, was drama, was theater, was weaving, was ceramics. It was the whole gamut of the visual arts. And so here you see Joseph Albers with a class, a painting class out on the porch. Here's a portraiture class with Zonti Shawinski. A dance class in the 1930s, if you can believe, this very kind of modernist looking dance that we'll come to know in the 60s, here in an early class in front of Abbott Hall. A music performer here studying with Heinrich Jalowitz, who came to teach music and composition. And you can see that they're having their class in the kitchen storeroom. They're right in front of the dinnerware is where they had set up the piano. It was very much at Black Mountain College always a culture of making do. They were doing their work and their education really on a shoestring. But one of the ways that they believed that arts could be at the very center of the curriculum is that they structured the week so that all of the arts classes took place on Fridays. And so there was never a conflict, and everybody, including faculty and students, could all take the arts classes. So at Black Mountain College, it's important to remember that it was a liberal arts school. So you might go there and study physics or mathematics, or you might study Russian. But in addition to studying all of those, at the kind of heart of the curriculum and the heart of your training would be the arts. Here's a photography class in the Cabbage Patch. Another defining feature of the college is that, and this was partly out of necessity, because as I said, the school rarely had very much money, was that they really believed that what happened outside the classroom was as important as what happened inside the classroom. So one of the ways that they developed a work program early on at the college. And so students and faculty were expected to participate in the functioning of the college. So maybe that mean that you washed dishes or collected trash like the artist Robert Rauschenberg did, or maybe you fixed showers like the artist Stan Vanderbeek did, or here are 2 young ladies that are walking down from the college farm. They actually had cows, and they ran a small farm that provided some of the crops and food for the students to be able to eat. Here's that same John Rice. Here's the leader of the school on the back of a pickup truck with a bunch of students. And this is when they're traveling over to build their second campus. They literally built with their own hands. They designed and built one of the major buildings on the second campus, which you can actually see here. It's this long building on Lake Eden, which was called the Studies Building. And this was really built and designed by students. And so all of this kind of work that might be seen as sort of happening outside the classroom was really the place where John Rice and much of the faculty believed some of the most important lessons were being learned about how to be a whole person, about how to use critical thinking skills in every aspect of one's life. And meals. Meal times were long at Black Mountain College. The food, people had different thoughts on the food. Some people loved it, some people hated it. But nonetheless, the tables were always very mixed. So faculty and students sat next to one another. And the language and the conversation at dinners and at breakfast was an important part of where learning would take place. So this points, I think, to the third thing that really distinguished Black Mountain College, is that there was less of a hierarchy between faculty and students. And one of the ways that this hierarchy was diminished is that the school was set up without a board of trustees. So most universities have a board of trustees that make many of the most important decisions of the college. But John Rice had decided that the faculty would really retain the rights to a lot of those decisions. And this set the agenda for a school that was going to have a different power dynamic, I think, than many other universities. And so here you can see a number of faculty, including next to the young man in the middle, just to the right of him is Joseph Albers, the professor there dancing. And this is the middle of North Carolina, rural North Carolina. These are college kids. They had to entertain themselves, and they did so with great parties, with balls, with all kinds of theater productions. So we came across tons of pictures of them carrying on these kind of social dances there. So between the sort of three defining features of arts being at the center of the curriculum, having a work program where the extracurricular was seen as very important, and having less hierarchy between student and teacher, you had the ingredients there for what I think is a very special experiment in education that happened in North Carolina in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Oh, and one of my favorite pictures of the many trips out to swimming holes that were taken during the course. One of the mathematics professors, Max Dane, he had an entire course that was mathematics for people who don't like math. And this class always started on hikes and trips out into the beautiful woods where they would study mathematics through nature. So John Rice had this idea that the arts should be at the very center of the curriculum. And he didn't just get the idea on his own. He got the idea by reading the writing of an important educator and philosopher named John Dewey. And John Dewey at the time had written a number of essays. One of them was Experiments in Art. And John Dewey had this idea of the art experience. And for those Dewey professors in the room, this is a very rudimentary version of what Dewey meant by that. And as he describes in the text, you set about, you have a piece of paper in front of you. Well, the first decision you make is what are you going to use to mark on that paper? What are you going to use as your writing tool? Where are you going to make the first mark on that paper? What's going to be the second mark? What's going to be the color that you use? And in thinking about all of those decisions of how you go together to make a drawing or to make a piece of art, there's an incredible amount of observation, an incredible amount of critical thinking, an incredible amount of self-reflection. And that those three things, observation, critical thinking, and self-reflection, are the kind of fundamental elements to being a fully formed human, to being somebody that could participate in a democratic society. And so Dewey has this idea that the art experience is a kind of rudimentary way of forming democratic citizens. And John Rice is inspired by this, and that's really one of the reasons he makes the visual arts at the very center of the curriculum. But he doesn't really know any artists. He's a classics professor. So he does have access to some people in upper echelons of society. So he travels up to New York City, and he goes and meets with a curator there at the Museum of Modern Art. And he tells the kind of vision of the school, and he says, who could I get as my first arts faculty, my first visual arts faculty? And Philip Johnson, the architect, the curator of architecture, he says, I have just the person. Joseph Albers, who was on faculty at the Bauhaus, the German art school. The Bauhaus, it's 1933, the Bauhaus had just decided to close rather than accept Nazi rule. So the Nazis had just closed the Bauhaus, and as we know, a huge amount of those faculty were now fleeing Germany and were seeking another place to live as exiles. Well, Joseph is married to Annie Albers, a very accomplished weaver, and Annie's maiden name was Fleischmann, so her family was Jewish, had Jewish descent, so they were looking to get out. And in one of my favorite moments in working on this show in the archive, I discovered the letters that were exchanged between John Rice invited Joseph Albers to come to the school. And John Rice writes, and he kind of describes his vision of the school, and he says, come and be our first visual arts teacher. And Joseph Albers writes back a very short letter. It was just one line, I do not speak English. And John Rice said, oh, that doesn't matter, come anyway, and goes on in this very superfluous way that he would often write. And indeed, later another faculty member wrote back to Joseph Albers in German and described the school, and Joseph and Annie Albers booked tickets, and they moved. They arrived in Asheville, North Carolina from Berlin, and were all of a sudden in rural North Carolina teaching art. They were really incredible teachers and really incredible people at the school, and really the kind of formation of the school cannot be imagined without their presence there. It was also a really prolific time for them as artists. These are some of the earliest works that Joseph Albers made when he was in the States. Black Frame on the left is the very first painting he finished at Black Mountain College. And you can see here, his fundamental interest as an artist and as a teacher between the 2 and 3 dimensions. How can you create an effect of a black frame that kind of floats and pulls apart from the background? Or his B&P exercise. If you had been a student in Joseph Albers' class, this is an exercise you would have done, where you would write the alphabet and rotate the letters to think about the relationship, the positive and negative relationship between a letter like B and P. And here that classroom exercise becomes the inspiration for this work, which is now in the Guggenheim's collection. It's a wonderful time for Ani Albers as an accomplished weaver at the Bauhaus. She relocates to Black Mountain College. They don't have a single loom there, but she has the plans for one of the looms that she has back in Germany and works with a local craftsman to build a loom and ends up making a series of incredibly beautiful weavings at Black Mountain College, including this piece with verticals. And I'll just put in a plug that one of the plans, the prints that was made in conjunction with verticals is on view at the Johnson Gallery. This afternoon I saw it, so it's really stunning to look at right here. One of the most interesting discoveries during the course of this project is that when we started, we really thought we were telling a story about American art. We thought that this story was going to be one about regional art, a kind of Southern art, but very quickly we were disabused of that idea, because the fact is that emigres were coming from all over the world, especially from Europe, and when they got here they weren't staying put. Joseph and Ani Albers took a dozen trips to Mexico while they were at Black Mountain College. Pretty much every chance they got for a break, they hightailed it to Mexico. And when they were there, Joseph Albers made incredible pictures here of Tenayuca, the incredible pyramid structure. And you can see here how he's also making a series of paintings based on the kind of forms and geometries that he's discovering in these ancient Mayan and ancient American ruins. And they also brought students with them. So, to think about these students as kind of moving between all of these sites was a really important part as we were understanding the story of Black Mountain College. This is a piece, Monte Alban, that Ani Albers made that's in the Harvard Art Museum's collection. An amazing weaving that again looks at the architecture and the geometries of Monte Alban, another pyramid structure. So it was a great time for them as artists, but perhaps more so it was what they did as teachers at Black Mountain College that was so incredibly important. Here's Joseph Albers in one of his classes. And I love this picture of a class because I like how it suggests the kind of hybrid student body at Black Mountain College. You have him here right down in the foreground, and he's doing another favorite exercise of his, which is where you would take a wire and you would bend it to create a three-dimensional form, and you would look at its two-dimensional reflection or shadow on the paper, right? Think about that same thing he was doing in Black Frame, the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional play between them. But circled around him there, this woman here with the white skirt, that's Hazel Larson Archer. You're going to see her photographs throughout my presentation. She is an amazing, still undiscovered photographer, mid-century American photographer, who started at Black Mountain College as a student and ends as a faculty of photography, something that happened to a number of students there. Next to her is Ray Johnson, a great young artist who would perhaps go on to be better known for his mail art in New York in the 1960s, but someone will get to see another piece of him. Here he's wearing his high school jacket. He was just 17 or 18 when he started at Black Mountain College, very young. And to his right is Nancy Newhall, who is the faculty wife of the curator Beaumont Newhall from the Museum of Modern Art, who had been invited down that summer. And what I'm interested in this category of the faculty wife, because many men, primarily, who were invited to teach at Black Mountain College came with incredibly accomplished spouses. And many of these women, such as Ani Albers, came to have a just meteoric, very important presence and prominence at Black Mountain College. And they were very integral to the kind of fabric of the school. In the case of Joseph Albers, remember he only speaks German, so it was Ani Albers who translated for him for the first years while he was teaching at Black Mountain College in all of his courses. So this is just one sampling of a class that would have happened at Black Mountain College, with all of these different kinds of people being in class together. Excuse me. So Joseph Albers pretty much imports the curriculum from the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus curriculum is a very established curriculum that is structured around color, form, and material. And I would say one of the largest surprises is who Joseph Albers became over the course of working on this project. Because what I know of Joseph Albers, in my mind, is somebody who is most famous for his Homage to the Square series, a very strict, abstract artist, comes from Germany, really focuses on kind of color and what I understood to be the purity of color. But studying his teaching, Joseph Albers became a very different kind of person to me. And he's not the kind of modernist artist I had thought him to be, but I would say rather he was a very postmodern artist. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean. So in this exercise, what Joseph Albers would have students do is that they would take these cut pieces of color-aid paper. So you would take a square of blue paper and you would lay it against a background of green or against a background of red. And you would change the color against which you laid your square of blue paper. And when you laid that blue against a different background, as anybody here who has done color exercises in art school knows, that blue looks totally different. Blue against red is not the same blue as blue against green. So if you kind of follow through the logic of that, what it would suggest is that there's no kind of singular purity of blue. There's no singular truth of what blue is. But blue's essence is contextual. It depends upon what it's next to. It depends upon what it's neighboring, which is a very postmodern concept, right? Instead of blue having a single truth, blue rather depends upon what its neighbor is, what its environment is, what the kind of perceptual experience of it is. And Joseph Albers, he wanted his students to really study seeing, to study sight, and to really study what those different changes made to your optics. And here's an example of them doing that in a class here. So this was a series of panels he made to sort of test out these lessons of color perception and the fungibility, the changeability of color and the nature of color. One of my favorite color studies is by Ray Johnson, an incredible piece from 1951 that does no justice to it on the slide, but is just these very tight, beautiful lines of color, studying again their interaction. And this was presented to me by the Ray Johnson Estate Curator as a color study that he did in Joseph Albers' class. And the first thing that we saw when we saw this was not so much a color study, but was in fact a weaving study. And this again is this moment where the impact of Ani Albers was right there with Joseph Albers. And so often I think we have instances where some of the female artists have been written out of histories or been kind of undermined in histories. And you see here how an artist is able to combine those two lessons together. And we know Ray Johnson, we know Robert Rauschenberg, we know many of these people studied weaving at Black Mountain College and actually made weavings there. So you can see them kind of assimilating and merging these two lessons together. Another beautiful piece that ended up being the cover of our book is this leaf study. It was a classic. If you took a class with Joseph Albers, remember they had no money, he would say, go out into the woods and collect a bunch of leaves. And you can imagine that these leaves were probably brilliant orange and red in autumn. And they would bring them back and set up these compositions of a series of color and formal composition studies. But the leaves had a lot of impact, because you can see leaf studies then becoming the idea for a weaving, or here this fabulous costume that Diana Wolfler has put together for a party where she's pasted the leaves to her body for one of the parties. And this kind of moment of a classroom exercise migrating out of the classroom, migrating into the kind of every other day aspects of life is something that we kept coming across in the archives and kept coming across in our research. And this was probably my favorite instance of that. On the right here is a kind of not very good quality slide, because it is from the 1940s, that Joseph Albers took of his students' projects. And this was the third leg of his curriculum, the matière study, the material study. And the basic idea of the matière study is that he would tell students to go out and find a number of different kinds of materials and put those materials together in such a way that it used the intrinsic quality of the material. So for instance, the fact that glass would break, or that wire would bend, or that paper would crumple. So use those qualities of a material to put them together so it didn't look like the material anymore. So again, this is not about a purity of material. It's not about understanding that, that steel is steel. It's rather about a kind of masquerade, a play of material. So what he very lovingly took photographs of all of his students' work, and at the time, slide film was quite expensive, so it was a real investment in these projects. And there are so many accounts of him being delighted by what students would bring in. My favorite one is that a student had brought in they were on these kind of trays, like at a Montessori school, where the students will work on trays, and they would bring in these trays and carefully lay them down on the floor. And Joseph Albers would famously circle around the trays and kind of give an expository on them. And he said there was this one where there were these little gray kind of mounds. And he said, oh, and this one is pebbles. And at the moment that he said it, the student blew. And it was revealed that it was cigarette ash that had been piled up to look like pebbles. And the student who writes the journal entry kind of, says Joseph Albers jumps with joy at having been duped by the student. And so you can see here a really different kind of Albers than maybe you thought about, or certainly than I thought about in starting this project. So we have the Matière study happening in the classroom. Well, what are they doing outside the classroom? They're getting ready for the Valentine's Day ball. It's 1940, and here's Joseph Albers, the teacher, with sea sponge attached to his chin and sea sponge attached to his eyebrows. And he's got spoons there that he's hammered down and bored a hole into to make some glasses. And so you've got these costumes that are really being inspired by this play with material. Here's Ani Albers. And in the exhibition, we wanted to play with this idea of lessons in and outside the classroom. And so we set this up as a slideshow. This was the first time any of these slides had been digitized and had really been made known. And I just love them. So it was, the Black Mountain College started, I said, in 1933, lasted till 57, so it's the tail end of the Great Depression, and they last through the very lean years of the World War. And there was never any money to start at Black Mountain College, but during those wartime years, it was really thin, and they really had this culture of making do with what they had. And I think that this kind of sense of making do really added to the creativity of the school. Here are a series of necklaces that Ani Albers makes with a student named Alexander Reed, and they're absolutely beautiful in person. Here you can see these corks with bobby pins, or on the right there's a set of washers with a ribbon that's just sort of woven into it. And these were made in 1940, and just a couple years later they were exhibited in a contemporary jewelry show at the Museum of Modern Art. So really recognized for their ingenuity at their time. And this sense, I think, that you can see in a lot of the education at Black Mountain College, they were rooted in these lessons, but then the materials that were used to create them and effectuate them were really spanned the whole spectrum and were incredibly inventive. So that was a section that was dedicated to pedagogy and sort of looked at all of the different sorts of lessons and mixing of lessons that was happening at Black Mountain College. Another section we focused on, we called modernisms. And our emphasis there was on the plurality of that. We think a lot about modernism and what is modernism, but we really wanted to argue that there's not a single modernism, but that there were a series of competing and coexisting styles that we might associate with modernism. And our argument here really came from our study of Black Mountain College. So Joseph Albers was the first fine arts instructor, but he invited an incredible range of people to teach with him at Black Mountain College. And while it's very clear to discern and to determine Joseph Albers' aesthetic in his own work, his tastes of what students should be exposed to really covered the entire map. So here you have Ilya Bolotowski, and you can see this kind of Piet Mondrian de Stijl, version, these very rectilinear lines, lots of primary and tertiary colors. Zanti Shawinski was coming from the Bauhaus. He taught theater. Both of these artists have work on view in this hotel in the lobby, so check it out in the flesh. Osip Zadkin and Leo Amino, two sculptors, also were there teaching at Black Mountain College, and you can just see the range here. Something that's cast resin and terracotta being taught within the same kind of curriculum. Really diverse range. So as we were beginning to look and kind of think about what it would be like to be a teacher at Black Mountain College, many art schools, and I do a lot of critiques at various art schools, you can often kind of tell an art school style. You can see something and you can say, oh, that's a Yale grad, or that's a Columbia grad. They kind of get this style that they start replicating. What was so strange about Black Mountain College is nobody's style was consistent. it was this huge mishmash of styles, and it was really exhilarating as a curator to see this kind of mix of styles. And so we came to kind of understand that this environment that was there, that was full of emigres from all over the world, that was, people that were coming from cities and staying for a summer, local people. It was just this incredible mix of people. It was an incredibly cosmopolitan environment. And we were interested in this idea of the coexistence of these styles. And one of the things that, as a trained art historian, it started making me question is one of the ways that we talk about 20th century art in the ways that we teach it. I know most of the courses that I had, and probably many of the courses you had, you would take this 20th century art survey. And the first half that went till 1950 was focused almost entirely on European art. You would study Cubism and Surrealism, and that was really focused on where the avant-garde art, the most vanguard, exciting art of the time was happening. And then boom, Jackson Pollock happens, abstract expressionism happens, and post-1950 you study American art, right? American art is really what the focus is of our curriculum. And my classes, they were entirely structured in this way. But it started to really break down for us at Black Mountain College, because what we found is that here, Fannie Hill-Smith, work that you can see downstairs, Robert Motherwell, these are both tabletops. This is Picasso and the Cubists' great subject matter of the tabletop. And here it's being explored by two American artists, especially Robert Motherwell, associated with kind of developing an abstract American idiom. Here taking on that subject matter and the manipulations of a cup and a plate and the sort of things that would be on top of a table. Or here, Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence and his wife, Gwendolyn Knight Lawrence, were invited to teach at the school in 1946, which is a pretty remarkable on its own, given the segregation at the time. And in fact, African American students were admitted to Black Mountain College in 1944, so way before they were admitted to many other schools. Jacob Lawrence comes down. Jacob Lawrence, in my training, is known as the American social realist. He is the artist documenting African American experience in America. And here, as we were looking at The Watchmaker, a portrait of somebody who's really focused on his craft. He's hunched over his table, working on this, has the eyepiece in. Behind him is this great motley collection of clocks behind him. But as we were looking at it, especially after seeing the Motherwell and the Fannie Hill-Smith, we said to ourselves, well, this is also really cubist. There's a lot of contortion of the form here. The table, when you're standing in front of this, literally looks like it's lifting up onto you. So could Jacob Lawrence be simultaneously an American social realist and cubist? Well, of course he could. Because at Black Mountain College, those things were not so tightly distinguished. It's only after the fact, in trying to teach art history and parse these things, that you want to partition how people are working. And so we began to see Jacob Lawrence as representative of this idea of encompassing multiple modernisms that could be European, that could be African American, that could be American simultaneously in a work like The Watchmaker. William de Kooning, Elaine de Kooning, come down in the summer of 1948. And it's an interesting story. Actually, Joseph Albers had invited Mark Toby, a much lesser known abstract expressionist artist, to come teach. And he had something happen at the very last minute and he couldn't come. And at the time, William de Kooning had only had one show at Charles Egan. It was kind of panned by critics. And so Joseph Albers invites him, extends the invite to William de Kooning, who of course would go on to be a much more famous artist. And William de Kooning works the entire summer on the piece that you see here, Asheville, and it is an absolute masterpiece. You can see this heavily worked surface that he's working on and developing the form. Robert Rauschenberg and Pat Pasloff, two young artists that come there and study with William de Kooning. Yardstick is an incredible piece that we had in our show. A real revelation, I would say, to a lot of audiences to discover Pat Pasloff's work. And you can see this picture in the lobby of the sorry, I said museum, but it's a hotel. The hotel right downstairs. So we always knew that dance and music were going to play a pretty big part in our show. And this is because when I started working on the project, I thought just 3 people went to Black Mountain College: John Cage, Merce Cunningham, and Robert Rauschenberg. I had no idea about all the other artists who went to Black Mountain College, but those 3 went there as well, and they were really important to the school. So we decided early on that we were going to have a grand piano in the space, we were going to have a sprung dance floor, and that this was going to be a really integral part of the show because it was an integral part of life and education at Black Mountain. So this was a real discovery for me, and for the musicologists in the room, I feel silly to say this, but I'll say it anyway, I'll out myself. John Cage is a composer, a musician who is really known for inventing new notational languages, new ways of notating music and developing language for music. So this is one of his pages of concert for piano and orchestra. And you look at this page and you see 3 different ways that you are thinking about how to mark notes on a staff. And they're incredibly graphic and beautiful and abstract. And I had kind of known this about John Cage, but I had never thought about what did David Tudor, his greatest performer, the pianist, great David Tudor, what did he do with these invented notational systems by John Cage? Well, he translated them back into music that a pianist could play. So we were out at the Getty Research Institute in LA, and we discovered this book by David Tudor, and it was regular music that I could read that was made for a piano. And it was David Tudor's first realization of John Cage's Concert for Piano and Orchestra, which was a solo for piano that he wrote and dedicated to Elaine de Kooning. So this was this kind of process of translation from an invented language to something that then could be played. And we became really interested in these translations that were happening at Black Mountain College and how indicative they were simultaneously of the inventiveness of what was happening there and the kind of experimentation, and at the same time, the practicality of it and what needed to sort of happen to make the performances. John Cage was, he first arrived as the accompanist of Merce Cunningham, the dancer that we'll speak about in a moment, and the choreographer, in the summer of 1948, and he returned many times after that. In 1952, he came with an idea of a class he was going to offer. So he wanted to make a project where he had brought with him 8 pre-recorded tapes, tapes that he had recorded around New York City where he lived, street sounds, things like this. And he had this score, which you see here, and this is a graphic score. So his idea was that he would lay the tape out in bands, and each of those cuts, they're either vertical or at an angle, are actually cuts that would be made to the tape, because he wanted to create a collage of sound. So as you cut these tapes and actually tape them together to create a new collage of sound. So this was his idea for Williams Mix. So he advertised it, he printed out this little 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, come join my class and help me make my collage of sound. Well, no students signed up. Because I think anybody here who has cut tape knows just how hard and laborious this process is. So he didn't have any takers that summer, but luckily he met Paul Williams, who the mix is named after, who funded him for the next year to make this piece. And I just wanted to play a little bit of it here. Okay, I won't make you sit through anymore. But you can see there, you can think about how that is constructed. Each of those little pre-recorded bits being cut and pasted together to create this kind of amazing abstract. I hear most in it a lot of urban sounds. I really hear the sounds of New York City, of traffic, of sirens, of people, of radio talking. And so this was one of the experiments that was happening at Black Mountain College. Merce Cunningham, I had said, he and John Cage came to the college when they were on this tour around the U.S., and John Cage was the pianist for Merce Cunningham. They came in 1948 and really fell in love with the place, and the place fell in love with him. When they left, all of the students and faculty filled their whole car with presents and with food to help them on the rest of their tour of the United States. And they were really overjoyed and came back then that summer and multiple summers after. And it was at Black Mountain College that Merce Cunningham actually formed his dance company. in the summer of 1952. Merce Cunningham was working as a choreographer in New York City, and as everybody knows here, that space is tight in New York City, time is tight in New York City, and what Black Mountain College had, they didn't have much money, but they had space and time. And so in the summer of 1952, he brought students and dancers down with him, and it was there the first time that he was able to work out the movements of the company together and really form his dance company there at Black Mountain. And would go on to be, one of the choreographers who's really thinking about very kind of pared down sense of everyday movements as dance in a kind of modernist idiom. So we also knew that dance was going to be really important to our experience in the show, but recorded dance only does so much. It's something so different about being there in front of dance. And so we worked with the local conservatory students to learn Merce Cunningham pieces and actually staged them in the exhibition. So when you would come through the show, you would have a chance to see live dance as part of the show. One of the things that we really did not anticipate was the impact of dance on other areas of the arts. We knew the story that we wanted to tell about Merce Cunningham, but we really didn't understand that Merce Cunningham's influence went so far beyond the dancers that he worked with. And one of my favorite stories that came out as I was working on the exhibition is the artist Ruth. She's a Japanese-American artist whose family was interned during the war. And it was in an internment camp where her arts teacher said, you should really think about Black Mountain College. It's a special place and you could really do something there. And so she went and she became one of the favorite students of Joseph and Annie Albers. And Joseph and Annie Albers brought her with them to Mexico. They really became very close. And Ruth Asawa developed this technique of weaving wire at Black Mountain College. And what you see here in this lobed sculpture, which is 108 inches, who does math really quickly? 8 feet, very tall, hanging from the ceiling. And this sort of lobed form, what Ruth Asawa calls that is her dancer form. And she said she arrived at that form in watching Merce Cunningham's dance class, dancing at Black Mountain College. And that for her, the kind of still shape that could embody the buoyancy, the airiness, the lift of a dancer was this lobed form for her. It's an incredible kind of inspiration in sculpture that really happened through this interaction with dance at Black Mountain College. This is a beautiful later Ruth Asawa piece that you absolutely have to see if you haven't, which is just downstairs in between the elevators on the ground floor as you're going up. Again, another wire piece here bundled, and then at the ends, just using this really simple technique of splitting that bundle to create this beautiful sun or flower shape. A fabulous piece. And Ruth was always very aware of shadows, and I wonder who she learned that from. If you remember that wire, that image of Joseph Albers with the wire on the piece of paper, that study of the wire and the shadow, right? Well, here's Ruth's amazing translation of it, much better than the teacher. But lots of people took dance at Black Mountain College. You didn't have to be a dancer to take dance at Black Mountain College. One of the Hazel Larson Archer, whose photograph this is, she was very involved with dance there. She also is somebody who used a wheelchair because as a child she had polio, and she talks about dancing with Merce Cunningham's company from the space of her wheelchair. It was kind of incredible environment. It was so touching when we heard that from her daughter. Here is her portrait of Robert Rauschenberg dancing. And Robert Rauschenberg would go on to have an amazing and long collaboration with Merce Cunningham. He is the person who made many of the set pieces for Merce Cunningham's dances. This is a piece, the dance is called Minutia, which is the same title as this set piece, which is a stretched fabric over this very simple wooden frame that the dancers would kind of move in and out of and dance with. And I knew this piece long ago when I was studying art history. This was actually, I remember, on one of my exams in my master's study. And at the time, before working on Black Mountain College, what I said about this piece is I said that it was all about using found objects and found materials and this sort of idea of reinventing detritus. And now I look at this piece and I can't help but see Joseph and Annie Albers' training. The sense of how important the textiles are, how the fabric are. This is anything but a color study and thinking about all of those very fundamental elements that Robert Rauschenberg was learning at Black Mountain. He also made costumes for Merce Cunningham, Here's Merce Cunningham performing Changeling, a solo that he worked on at Black Mountain College in a beautiful, interesting, I would say, costume that is maroon that we remade for the exhibition, designed by Robert Rauschenberg. And here's a piece that Robert Rauschenberg made with his wife at the time, Susan Weil. So Robert Rauschenberg and Susan Weil had met in Paris. They were studying over there. And Susan Weil told Robert Rauschenberg about Black Mountain College. And they decided to come and study the next school year. And they were there at the time and made a series of these monoprints that were exposed on blueprint paper. So they would literally lay objects or figures on light-sensitive paper, expose it to the sun or expose it to strong lamps, and get these kind of incredible silhouettes. And this is so interesting to think about in the context of what Robert Rauschenberg is doing at the time, because he's dancing. So these are not only photographic processes, these are also thinking about indexes of the body, and the body kind of in this space with the paper. Another piece Robert Rauschenberg made, which does not produce on slides ever, called Night Blooming. This is in the summer of 1952, and this is the summer after his relationship with Susan Weil had disintegrated, because Robert Rauschenberg realized that he was falling in love with Cy Twombly, and he was coming out. And it was this really difficult moment in his life, because he just had a young child, Christopher, and he was coming out to himself and falling in love with Cy Twombly, an incredible young painter. And he makes Night Blooming at Black Mountain College. And he makes it by taking a painting that is a really thick gessoed background, and then he lays it on the ground. And he rubs it into the gravel and lifts it up. And so as you're looking at this painting, you see all this kind of texture of dirt and gravel in the body of the painting. Would he ever have thought to lay a painting on the ground had he not participated in dance? Had he not done that experiment in photography? It's so interesting to think about these kind of decisions. Cy Twombly, also working on it that same summer before him and Robert Rauschenberg head off to travel around North Africa and Italy. So as we're starting to kind of really look at what are artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Cy Twombly doing with their work, one of the things that we came to think a lot about is their work with the hand and their real interest in tactility and sensation. And we went back to an early experience that we had at the Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center, which is an amazing place in Asheville. And it is there that they have this loom, which is one of the looms that Ani Albers has built by craftsmen in North Carolina. And when we were first looking at this loom, we had this kind of dumb aha moment where we realized that it is so close to the structure of a piano. That the loom has these pedals, it has these strings, it has this really complex system of levers and strings behind it. And so we decided to do something in the show which we believed was really representative of Black Mountain College, which is to put the grand piano, a symbol of the height of Western culture, on the same plane as the loom, this kind of lowly craft tool. And in many other spheres, the loom and the grand piano probably wouldn't be equated. But at Black Mountain College, they were totally non-hierarchical, and they were really respected and treated in such an identical way. And that led us to, and you can see here some of the woodworking the students were doing. So students were really working in so many different media. And what it led us to discover is that in a lot of the visual art that many of the students were making, they were exploring texture and a sense of touch. And they did that through all kinds of different ways. They did that through using scraps of fabric and sewing it together. They did it a lot through the effect of shadow on a surface, or finding textured surfaces like natural stone or corrugated metal. And there seemed to be a kind of the only style, the only through line that we could find is this interest in what we call the haptic, which is an idea that comes out of philosophy, which is an idea that when you have an experience of looking at something, you can sometimes imagine how it feels. And the best example I have of this is looking at velvet. Like if you look at velvet, you immediately get a sense of how that would feel to run your hand on it. And that was often, we think, one of the things that was leading students to make the work that they were at Black Mountain College. And we think that that related back to the emphasis on craft and working with the hand, and even the work program and the kind of value that that handwork had, along with the work of the mind and the work of the eyes. It's a beautiful paper piece by Ruth using the Black Mountain College laundry stamp here as this kind of gorgeous curtain down the piece of paper. And this is a film at Black Mountain College that Nicholas Cernovich and Catherine Litz made together of the only extant film that we have from the time. I'll just play a real quick little bit of it. You can see here it's silent 16mm film. She's wearing this raw silk outfit, dancing under this canopy of trees. Often the body is almost entirely abstracted in the whole 3-minute film, and kind of shown in part and very much this highly textured interest of exploration through film. Going. So our show ended because Black Mountain College ended with pottery and poetry. Students had long wanted pottery. They had been campaigning Joseph Albers for pottery from very early on, but Joseph Albers did not allow it because he believed pottery didn't have enough resistance, was what his term was. And it's hard to kind of imagine what he meant by this, but in his kind of idea, it didn't have enough of its own structure to be a good learning material. So Joseph Albers leaves, and almost immediately the students build a pottery studio, and they have this great pottery program that runs throughout the 1950s. People like Marguerite Wildenhain, Shoji Hamada, one of the great Japanese potters, comes through Black Mountain College and gives an amazing lesson of thinking about the art of Zen through a silent process of working on the wheel, and that becomes very influential to a number of students who see it. Peter Volkus is there. And along with the potters were the poets. And Charles Olson, the great poet, was the final director of Black Mountain College. And it was really with him that the Black Mountain Poets, and a kind of new branch of American poetry, was both given a voice and founded, and it was also the end of the school. He was, by his own account, a pretty terrible administrator. And the school really kind of fractured, and at the end became, 13 people, 13 mostly writers who were living together in the final years of Black Mountain College, but they weren't really forming a school anymore. But in the few years that are there, they make a tremendous amount of poetry, really interesting poetry, and often there's collaborations happening in printmaking at the time. So here, Cy Twombly has made this cover for a broadsheet of a poem by Robert Duncan. It's really interesting. When Charles Olson is there, he talks a lot about this idea of projective voice. And I just want to end with this because it's an interesting theory that he had about poetry, and I think it kind of comes out in some ways at Black Mountain College. And he believed that, in writing a poem, you have a page, the page of the paper. But the page of the paper should really be this space for composing, and that words are not separate from our voice. And so he put a lot of emphasis into the spoken word and the kind of performance of the breath in speaking, and thinking about the page that one writes poetry on as a space of free composition, that one could kind of lay down letters and words anywhere on the page. And these kind of two ideas were incredibly influential to a series of poets who then would go on to write the Black Mountain College Review, which made its way out to San Francisco into the hands of people like Allen Ginsberg and the beat poets in San Francisco, and became kind of a cri de coeur for a lot of those beat poets in San Francisco in the formation of much of the work that they were doing out there. So though Black Mountain College ended, and this is the kind of final blow up that we ended with the show, which for me is this total call to the 60s. These guys are hanging out drinking beer in front of a bar. They've got the cool sunglasses on. It's a different era in 1957 than it was in 1933. But in the course of those, short 24 years, what Black Mountain College accomplished was really producing some of the most incredible practitioners of poetry, of visual art, of dance that we know in America in the 20th century. And it was an incredible experiment in education, an experiment in art, an experiment in communal living that I think in some ways had to come to an end. Oftentimes I'm asked, why did Black Mountain College end? And there's a series of practical answers, and then there's the answer that I think is most true to my heart, which is that it had to end. That its ending was kind of in its very DNA from the beginning. That for Black Mountain College to be this experimental space, it had to resist the sort of institutional structures that would have led it to not be Black Mountain College for it to kind of go on. And so Black Mountain College did indeed end. 57 actually marks when it sold off its last piece of property, which was a cow. It was the last piece of property to be sold off. And that was also the end of the show. So thank you so much for being such an attentive audience tonight. And I'm happy to spend some time out in the lobby. If anybody has any questions, I'd be really happy to speak with you and answer them there.